I don't usually get sent to jobs with anybody, which suits me fine. People are all right, I suppose, but I'm not built for chat. I'm terrible at eye contact and I always miss the punchlines. Apparently, I've got the social instincts of a damp traffic cone. Still, I like what I like, and that's all the boring wartime stuff no one under 60 gives a toss about. I've learned not to bring that up unless someone's very bored, very polite, or already halfway through a Scotch egg so they can't tell me to shut up. Anyway, the job was a disused tunnel flagged under the South Cut Clearance Survey. No one had set foot in there since 1944, and when something's been sealed that long, you've no idea what you're walking into. The railway company wanted it assessed for potential public access tourist trains, heritage lines, that sort of thing. So they sent me with Dan. He was in his early 20s, one of those blokes who couldn't function without his AirPods, a vape, and a running commentary on UFC fights. Not my usual preference, but I've survived worse. I once did a week on the Carl line with a bloke who thought Dunkirk was in Germany. Our job was simple enough. Log debris, test the clearances, and ensure the place wouldn't shear a wagon in half when they opened it up for public use in the summer. It looked promising on paper. They'd greenlight a proper restoration team if we gave the all-clear. If not, they'd break it up and pretend it never happened. Railway bureaucracy at its finest. We were scheduled to have our preliminary report filed by the end of the week. Our boots hit the ballast just past 5 in the morning, geared up in our safety kit. Hard hats, high-vis jackets, respirators, tool bags, and radios clipped to our chests. The tunnel entrance was locked up tight with heavy-gauge chain-link fencing, 2 layers deep, backed by timber boards and secured with a padlock the size of your fist. Someone had clearly been at it with bolt cutters at some point. The cuts were rough and it had been clumsily patched up with zip ties and wire. Above it all, the original cast iron arch loomed, rusted and stamped with a wartime engineering mark you'd miss unless you knew what you were looking for. Once we cracked the venting system and slipped inside, we clicked on our torches, both beams cutting clean lines through the misty black ahead. The air hit us once we got far enough in. Even with respirators, it felt like licking the inside of an old kettle. Every step we took stirred up decades of settled dust that hung in the air like a fog. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the ballast and the distant echo of our breathing through the filters. Dan glanced around nervously and muttered, "Bit grim in here, isn't it?" "Yeah, can't imagine coming in here without respirators," I replied, adjusting my face mask. "Have you ever heard of the Cross Line?" Dan shook his head, looking puzzled. "Is that like a brand or something?" "Nah, that's the name of the line this tunnel was part of," I explained, warming to the subject despite myself. They used it to move supplies between coastal depots and the RAF sites during the war. Mostly crates of ammunition, fuel drums, and the odd medical unit when casualties were heavy. The logistics were actually quite impressive for the time, considering the bombing raids. March 1944, they caught a Luftwaffe airstrike at the southern mouth just as a supply train broke down inside. Dan's voice came quiet over the crunch of our boots. "Never heard of that one," he said, genuinely interested now. "The blast created a vacuum effect," I continued, perhaps too brightly for such a grim subject. "Sucked a fireball straight down the tunnel while they were still trying to fix the locomotive. The physics of it were actually quite fascinating, the way confined spaces can channel and amplify explosive force." "Whoa, were there any survivors?" Dan asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I gave a dry shrug, suddenly feeling uncomfortable with my own enthusiasm. Place would have been charred end to end by the time the fire burnt out. With another line still running and a war to fight, they didn't bother with a recovery crew. Just sealed it up and moved on. Dan stayed quiet after that, his boots crunching beside mine in the darkness. I didn't say anything else either, suddenly aware of how callous I must have sounded. The weight of what had happened here, the lives lost, seemed to press down on us both as we walked deeper into the tunnel's throat. After a few minutes, Dan cleared his throat and muttered something about a featherweight bout he'd watched last weekend. Like he couldn't bear the quiet any longer. This bloke came in underweight and still managed to drop the other guy in the second round with a spinning elbow. Absolute belter, he called it. I nodded, grateful for the mood change even if I had no clue who he was on about. UFC wasn't exactly my area of expertise, but his enthusiasm was infectious. At least it was better than dwelling on the ghosts of 1944 that seemed to lurk in every shadow our torches couldn't quite reach. It wasn't long after that when we started noticing signs the tunnel had taken a knock or two over the decades. A few ceiling plates were broken, with rusted bolts hanging loose like broken teeth, and there was a shallow pile of crumbled brick near one of the cable housings that looked more recent than the rest. Nothing structural that would threaten the integrity of the tunnel, but enough to keep your eyes peeled for potential hazards. The mortar between some of the older bricks had cracked and crumbled, leaving gaps where small animals might have made their homes over the years. Then we started spotting bits of cloth scattered about, mostly torn and oily, ground deep into the gravel like they'd been there for years. The fabric was strange. Some pieces looked almost like canvas, others more like wool or cotton. Most of it was so degraded you couldn't tell what it might have been originally. There was one piece twisted under a bolt that caught my attention. It looked like canvas, only thinner, with an odd texture that didn't seem quite right. "What do you think it is?" Dan asked, crouching down to get a better look at the strange material. "Could be a leftover sleeve from the poor souls they sealed up in here," I said, unable to resist a bit of dark humor. Dan stared at me for a beat, his face pale in the torchlight. "You're joking, right?" "Of course I am," I said, half laughing at his expression. "It's probably just a bit of coat from some daft trespasser poking around where they shouldn't have been. Does look weird, though." Dan shook his head but seemed relieved. "Should handle this properly," he muttered, pulling on his work gloves. "Stuff like this can trip someone up if they don't see it. Proper hazard if it's sticking up like that." He crouched over the fabric and gave it a thorough once-over with his gloved hands, testing its texture and checking how securely it was embedded in the ballast. "Feels weird," he said, frowning. "Bit tougher than I was expecting. Not what you'd expect from old clothing." "All right," I said, watching him pull out a multi-tool from his bag. "I'll log the next segment up ahead. The junction box should be just past the bend." I tapped the radio clip to my chest. "Channel 4, yeah? Shout if you need anything or if the fabric starts acting all haunted. Either way, I'll come running." Dan snorted with laughter. "If it does much of anything, I'm legging it straight out of here." "Fair play," I said, and carried on ahead into the deeper darkness. The tunnel seemed to swallow me up with each step, the air growing thicker and more oppressive. It was damp and stale, like the breath of something that had been sleeping for decades. Every 20 or 30 yards, there was a refuge bay built into the wall, alcoves designed for workers to duck into when trains passed through. I made a habit of counting them as I walked, partly to pass the time and partly to keep track of how far I'd come. Just after the 8th bay, I spotted the glint of twisted steel in my torchlight, the husk of what had once been a freight wagon. My heart actually gave a little thump of excitement and dread combined. It was the supply train from the Cross Line story I'd rambled to Dan about, still sitting here after all these years like a monument to that long-ago tragedy. The wagon was completely gutted, half-melted across the rails where the fireball had caught it. One axle had folded in on itself from the intense heat, and most of the wooden siding was gone, peeled back like a tin of Spam that had exploded. What remained of the wagon was pitted with rust and speckled with decades of bat droppings from whatever creatures had made their homes in the tunnel's depths. My torch played over the wreckage, and I caught disturbing hints of the original disaster, singed fabric fused into the rivets like grotesque decorations and what looked like melted boot soles stuck beneath the wheel assembly. The metal was warped and twisted into impossible shapes, testament to the incredible heat that had roared through this confined space. I felt a mixture of giddiness at the historical discovery and grim sorrow for the lives lost here. Then there was movement. Just beyond the wreck, something disturbed the gravel with a soft scraping sound that made my blood run cold. I froze, torch fixed dead ahead, trying to convince myself it was just a bit of debris finally giving way to gravity after decades of precarious balance. But just where my light couldn't quite reach, in that gray zone between illumination and absolute darkness, I noticed a shape moving slowly and jerkily, dragging itself from the far side of the destroyed carriage. At first, I thought some homeless person had found a way in and picked this godforsaken place for shelter. "You can't be here, mate," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "There's hazardous conditions down here, structural damage, potential gas pockets. You need to clear off. I won't press charges or anything, just get out while you can." My words echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off the curved walls and coming back distorted. That was when the figure shifted properly into my light, and what I saw made every rational thought flee from my mind like smoke. The first thing I noticed was that it looked like he was wearing someone else's skin, or at least trying to. "You can't be here, mate," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "There's hazardous conditions down here, structural damage, potential gas pockets. You need to clear off. I won't press charges or anything, just get out while you can." My words echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off the curved walls and coming back distorted. That was when the figure shifted properly into my light, and what I saw made every rational thought flee from my mind like smoke. The first thing I noticed was that it looked like he was wearing someone else's skin, or at least trying to. My boots skidded over the loose ballast and I went down hard, landing like a sack of bricks with a grunt of pain and surprise. My torch slipped from my grip, skittering across the gravel and coming to rest a few feet in front of me, its beam fixed squarely on the abomination that had once been human. I didn't go for the torch, every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. So I turned and bolted, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free, feet slipping and sliding over the loose stone as I fled back toward the entrance. I threw myself into the nearest refuge bay and crouched low in the darkness, my breath snagging in my throat in short, panicked gasps. The respirator made everything worse, each breath a reminder of how trapped I was in this underground nightmare. I stayed silent, listening desperately for footsteps or any sign that the thing was following me until I realized the texture under my knee wasn't ballast stone. Whatever it was felt tacky and wet, sticking to my work trousers like partially dried glue. I reached for my phone with trembling hands and lit the lock screen, the pale glow spilling over my immediate surroundings. What I saw in that sickly light made my stomach lurch violently. It was torn flesh, human skin missing in wet flaps and chunks, peeled and cut away messily to expose the glistening muscle and slashed tendons beneath. It was clear that whoever or whatever this had been, they had done this to themselves, carved away their own flesh in some incomprehensible act of self-mutilation. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the phone steady as I cut the light and pressed back hard against the cold stone wall of the refuge bay, every inch of me wound tight with a panic so pure it felt like electricity running through my veins. I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly, terrified that the slightest sound would give away my hiding place. I strained to listen for any sign that the thing out there had heard me scrambling into the alcove, but there was only a faint sound of metal clinking against metal and some sort of wet, sloshing noise that I didn't want to think about too hard. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I shifted forward just enough to risk a glance around the bay's edge, and what I saw explained why the creature wasn't pursuing me with the relentless hunger I'd expected. The thing was caught on heavy steel cabling that had somehow fused into its flesh, the metal wires embedded deep in what remained of its legs. The cables carved deep, wet gouges through the meat where they had melted and cooled, creating a grotesque anchor that prevented the creature from moving freely. Every attempt to surge forward sent a fresh jerk through its twisted frame as the cables dragged it back like a leash. As horrific as the sight was, I felt a twisted jolt of relief wash over me, because it meant the thing couldn't reach me, couldn't hunt me down in these narrow confines. I crept forward on all fours as slowly as I could manage, keeping my eyes fixed on the struggling creature. It was still jerking against its metal restraints, still trying to drag itself forward with those raw, exposed legs, but making no real progress. I kept going until my fingers found my drop torch and closed around it gratefully. Just as I was shimmying backward toward the safety of the refuge bay, my radio crackled to life with a burst of static that seemed impossibly loud in the tunnel's oppressive silence. Southcut Control, this is Red Leader. Enemy overhead, repeat, enemy aircraft sighted. Brace for impact. The transmission was tiny and filled with static, like an echo from another time entirely. But the creature heard it clearly enough. It jerked harder against the cables, responding to the sound with renewed fury. It threw itself forward with a raspy scream that echoed through the tunnel like the cry of a damned soul, its limbs stretching at sick angles as the cabling bit deeper into its flesh. The sudden frenzy of movement and that inhuman shriek broke whatever composure I had left. I turned and ran at full sprint, torch clutched tight in my sweaty palm, breath slicing through the respirator in short, panicked bursts. Then Dan's voice filtered through the static on my radio, crackling and distorted. Callum, mate, I heard him breathing fast and shallow like he was trying not to be heard by something nearby. Something's here. I can't. His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by more static. I fumbled for the radio with shaking hands. Dan, I'm on my way, just hold on. Don't move, all right? Whatever's down here, it's not right. Just come back to where I left you. Come back. Another burst of static answered me, and then no reply at all. The silence was worse than any scream. I ran through the darkness, trying to keep my bearings while every bone in my body begged me to look back over my shoulder. I knew the first creature hadn't gotten free. I hadn't heard the sound of snapping cables or pursuing footsteps, but my body didn't care about logic. I couldn't stop imagining it somehow breaking loose and hunting me down, dragging itself through the tunnel with superhuman determination. Every step felt too slow, every breath too loud. I wanted nothing more than to grab Dan and escape from this underground hell, to feel sunlight on my face and breathe air that didn't taste of death and decay. When I reached the spot where I'd left Dan, his tool bag was still sitting exactly where he'd placed it, but there was no sign of him anywhere. My torch flicked frantically across the tunnel walls until it caught on a maintenance tunnel branching off to the side, narrow and half-choked with decades of accumulated dust and debris. I stepped toward it, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Dan? Dan! I called, cursing myself for not just booking it straight out of the tunnel alone. Then I saw him hunched over near the far wall of the maintenance passage, breathing in shallow rasps, his back turned and shoulders twitching like he was about to be sick. Dan? I said again, quieter this time, relief flooding through me. I saw something down by the wreck. It was wearing someone's skin or something. I don't know what it was, but we need to get out of here right now. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The skin along his spine looked torn and stretched. His proportions somehow off, too broad in the shoulders, too long in the limbs. I realized with growing horror that this was one of those skin creatures, and this one had done a much better job of wearing Dan's appearance than the last one had managed. It shifted, turning with fluid, unnatural grace. Dan's face twitched as the thing twisted its neck at an impossible angle, straightened up, and lunged straight toward me with inhuman speed.